Welcome to the Leadership for Society speaker series. This year's theme is Tensions, Business, Civic Society, and Politics. I'm Brian Lowry, professor at Stanford Graduate School of Business. And today I'm speaking to Dr. Peter Gleick, co-founder and senior fellow of the Pacific Institute, which focuses on the world's most pressing problems associated with water. Peter is the author of several books. The most recent, 3 Ages of Water, was published in 2023. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
I'm happy to be here.
Great. So I'm going to start off with an obvious question. Water is pretty accessible to most of us. Not everyone, but to most of us, I'd say, at least in the United States. So it's easy to take it for granted. So if I go into my home and I turn on the tap and the water comes on, tell me why I should be concerned about water. Like why is there a whole institute on water?
Okay, so first of all, you should be concerned because of the possibility that one day you're going to go into your bathroom and turn on the tap and water isn't going to come out. And that would be a sort of a crisis, I would think. Mm-hmm. And the reality, of course, is that much of the world isn't like us in the richer parts of the planet. There are probably 2 billion people worldwide that don't have access to safe water and sanitation, that can't go into a room and turn on a tap and get safe, cheap, affordable, accessible water. And of course, there are all sorts of other water problems. I'm sure we can talk about the different kinds of crises that we face. But because water is so important to us, even those of us who take it for granted probably shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned people around the world. So let me ask a question. Is water a global issue or a local issue? So obviously we're concerned about, we're good people. We're concerned about people in the world. But as we focus on water, is it the kind of natural resource that you think about? Like certain countries have mineral deposits, right? And so they have to manage those. We all have some degree of water, and it's all managed locally. Or should we think about it as kind of like air, which it turns out you could have wildfires in China blowing smoke into California, or wildfires in Oregon blowing smoke into, Canada, in which case it's really not a local issue. It doesn't respect these kind of boundaries. How do we think about water? Is it a global issue or a local issue?
Yes, it's absolutely both. Your examples are really good ones. Many of our water problems are local. We have local watersheds, we have local water systems, we have local institutions. Water is often a local issue, but there are aspects of what I would describe as the global water crisis that are global, where you can't ignore boundaries, where something that happens in one place has an impact or an influence somewhere else. The failure to provide safe water to billions of people, that's not necessarily a day-to-day crisis for me, but the extent to which it might affect international politics or international economics is important. Water crosses political boundaries, and often a lot of the conflict we see over water worldwide is water that isn't constrained by a single political entity or a single political border. And of course, something like global climate change is in many ways a water problem. It affects demand for water. It affects where and when we get water. So depending on the particular problem you're interested in, I think we could think of it as both local and global.
Got it. So if we were to focus on the United States right now, what do you see as the biggest challenge in the states associated with water? And you can tell me it's like local. Maybe the biggest challenge you see right now is, drought in California, the consequences there, or maybe the biggest challenge is in some other part of the country. But as someone who studies this, if you think about the United States, what do you think of as the biggest challenges we face right now with water?
Well, again, I would say we have many problems in the U.S. related to water. Even here in the U.S., there are substantial populations, perhaps as 2 million people or more, who don't have access to safe water and sanitation, largely in disadvantaged frontline communities. The Native American lands have often never had access to safe water and sanitation, so that's a problem. But, we have problems in Jackson, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan, where communities don't have access anymore or might have never had access to safe water. I think of global climate change as a problem that's causing challenges for water resources. We think of extreme climatic events like floods and droughts are getting worse already.
Hmm.
We know that's due to human-caused climate change, and that affects different communities at different times. But that's a challenge as well. We have underinvestment in water infrastructure. That's an economic challenge that's facing us. So there are plenty of problems here in even a rich country like the U.S.
Got it. So, should we think about water as a basic human right? And if so, is it the government's responsibility to ensure that everyone has adequate drinking water and water for their basic needs?
I do think of water as a human right. I've worked on this issue for a long time, arguing in the 1990s that water was a human right. It was a debate countries were having and the United Nations was having. And that debate ended in 2010 when the UN finally declared a formal legal human right to water at the international level. California has a law now that has declared a human right to water. South Africa was one of the leaders in this in the 1990s. After apartheid fell, the new government in South Africa had the chance to rewrite their water laws and their constitution. And the new constitution in South Africa in 1994, I think it was, declared a human right to water. Now, what does that mean? Is it the responsibility of governments to provide water for those communities that don't have it? Is it the responsibility of water agencies or utilities or local governments to do it? The implementation of what water is a human right means is still an ongoing debate.
Hmm. So I want to follow up on that. So you also mentioned places that don't have drinking water in the states right now. So native lands, Flint, Michigan, Jackson, Mississippi, and I'm sure there are other places as well. Who's responsible for the violation of those people's rights? If these are human rights and they don't have the right, they don't have drinking water, has the government failed them? Is it private industry? Like, how do we make sense of the fact that in this country, there are people that do not have access to drinking water? What are the tensions that are producing that problem?
Well, in the largest sense, I would argue that it's a failure of governments. To the extent that water is a human right and a public good, I would argue it's the responsibility of governments to ensure that their populations, wherever they are, have access to those things. It's a little complicated because, in the United States, water provision is often a public water utility or sometimes a private company. We have probably 15% of the population in the US gets its water from private water companies. Now, those are monopolies. They're regulated by public agencies, by public utility commissions. But we've not done a good job as a set of governments at different levels at ensuring that populations have access. Again, the state of California passed a law saying there's a human right to water, and the state's trying to figure out now how to provide water for the populations in the Central Valley, for example, farm worker communities, some of the Native American reservations that don't have access to safe water, how to provide that water. They're trying to provide money. They're trying to require water utilities to interconnect populations that don't have access with maybe water utilities that do have access, but it's unresolved.
Hmm. So we've been focusing a lot on drinking water, but water obviously has a number of important critical purposes, right? So there's obviously drinking water and sanitation, but there's also agriculture. In some places, there's energy production, there's manufacturing. So when we think about the allocation of water, who's making those decisions? How is water allocated across the different needs that society has?
Well, and again, in different places, it's allocated differently. In the Western United States, typically we allocate it under Western law, water law, something called the prior appropriations doctrine, or first in time, first in right. When the West was settled by white settlers, water rights were given out by whoever was there first, the mining companies, early agricultural interests, and water rights were claimed, and water right filings were made, and a lot of the water in the Western United States was given out under these prior appropriation rules. Interestingly enough, in the Eastern United States before that, water was given out by something called the riparian doctrine. If you were alongside of a river, you had the right to use that river. It didn't matter if you were there first. If you were there, you had the right to use water. But in the scarcer parts of the world, it's typically under some form of water rights. Now, of course, the water rights that were given out in the Western US they weren't given out really to the people who were here first, to the indigenous populations. And a lot of the legal battles we've seen over water has been efforts by, for example, some of the Indian tribes to reclaim or to claim their water rights under even earlier rights of existence. And there have been all sorts of cases in the Western U.S. associated with that.
Yeah. This may be an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How have competitions for scarce water actually played out? Right. So you talk about, I don't know that much about how it's played out, but in California, there was clearly competition among the agriculture, which is people talk about as small family farms, but often it's big agriculture. And then there's the residential use and industrial uses of water outside of agriculture. How, in reality, how does it usually play out? Who wins?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Again, in the West, because we've allocated under this first in time, first in right situation. Again, ignoring the people who really were here first. And I would say ignoring the environment. The environment has no water rights, even though we now understand the importance of preserving water for natural ecosystems. That's another piece of the water crisis that we face, is sort of the devastation to natural ecosystems that the rules that we operate under have deprived ecosystems of. And we don't have water markets in the traditional sense. Water is not considered really an economic good, with some exceptions. And so figuring out how to balance the first in time, first in right allocations, the water rights regimes, with the concepts of water economics and water markets, and the concept of the human right to water, that's a fight that has never fully been resolved. And we're still fighting to this day, not just in the Western US, but all around the world, about how to balance all of those competing interests. You know, economists would love to say, look, we could figure this out. Just put a price on water and the market will take care of it. It'll balance the higher values of water, those who will make the most money or produce the most economic benefit from water. But again, that ignores natural ecosystems. It ignores communities that maybe don't value water for its economic use, but value water for its historical and cultural and religious significance.
Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the Western regime, I forget how you described it, first use, first right, or something like that. Is that the language?
First in time, first in right is
first in time, first in right.
Way
and it sounded like you were referring a lot to mining interests, or industry that came out here first, and they still maintain the rights. So I want to talk a little bit about private industry. Is it the government's responsibility to ensure that private industry, like that, let's call that power, agriculture, any other kind of industry, have sufficient water? So one way I can ask this question is, should we think of water like roads or public education, right? It allows society to run smoothly, but some people benefit more than others from those public goods, right? So if you run a business, you don't have to educate all of your employees because the government takes care of that basic education. You don't have to build your own roads because the government takes care of that. We all pay for that, presumably, because we all benefit. And some people benefit more than others. So should we think of that as government's responsibility to take care of, in some sense, to support private industry in terms of their water needs, because it supports all of us?
Well, I do believe that because water is a human right and a public good, there's a really important role for government to ensure that the public values that we think are important, the access to safe water and sanitation, the health of natural ecosystems is protected. 80% of the water that we use in the West, and frankly, 80% of the water we use worldwide, goes to agriculture. It's absolutely critical for growing food, and that is a value that needs to be protected. But water is also critically important for the goods and services that we want. And industry, there's an economic value, economic markets to some degree for industrial water uses. A gallon of water used in industry produces a lot more economic benefit than a gallon of water used in agriculture. And so industry uses a lot of water to do the things that they want, and they produce high economic value for it. But again, it has to be balanced with the need to grow food and the need to protect ecosystems. And that's the debate of the 21st century, I would argue, how to balance those competing interests with a limited, scarce resource.
So I'll give you let me see what you think about this other position. Maybe for-profit industry should have to solve their own water problem subject to regulation because they're extracting value for whoever, their shareholders or for the owners of the companies. And that shouldn't be the government's responsibility to take care of them. What do you think about that position?
Well, I think that's true in part. I do think there are public interests that private interests don't care about. I mean, this is the classic challenge of externalities. The corporations don't care or didn't used to care, or we could debate about the extent to which they care today about the impacts on the environment of their water use. Agriculture doesn't either, because we didn't value, or we didn't know we ought to value, natural ecosystems in the past. Corporations didn't care about the wastewater that they discharged into public waterways, and that led to a lot of the environmental disasters of the 1950s and 60s and 70s, where water contamination was terrible and where rivers were catching fire and ecosystems and lakes were dying. That was the classic Cuyahoga River burning problem in the 1960s that led in part to the environmental movement in the United States, because corporations didn't have to pay for their externalities. And that led to public laws. It led to the Clean Water Act at the federal level, the Safe Drinking Water Act at the federal level. And so that's sort of the balance between wanting industries to produce goods and services, but also wanting industries to pay for their externalities.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about these new technologies coming along to generate fresh water? So I've seen some things that are a little bit more, what I would say, kind of further out there technologically, where you're pulling water from the air and using that for purposes where you need fresh water, or more commonly, but also on my understanding is more expensively, desalination plants. So what if we said, like, hey, private industry, you need these water uses. Water is scarce. With the water that's coming from, groundwater or snow melt in the West, that's going to be allocated to residential private use. You need more than that, or you don't have access to that. Find another way to generate it technologically. What do you think about that kind of position?
Well, I'm a huge fan of the idea of technological innovation to help solve a lot of our water problems. And to some degree, many of our water problems don't need new technology. They require better application of technology that's existed for a century: water purification, water treatment, water distribution systems. But the potential for new technologies to improve and cut, for example, the cost of desalination, the ability to tap into the 97% of the planet's water that's salt, is important. And we know how to desalinate, and it's already a technology that's in use in particularly water scarce areas, but it's energy intensive, it's technologically expensive. So the extent to which improvements in that area could develop are important. The idea that we could develop technology to pull water out of the air, again, we know how to do that, but it's pretty expensive right now. I would love to see really cheap, easy water quality testing that would permit rural areas to test their water quality cheaply for a whole range of contaminants. We're not able to do that now. Water testing is pretty expensive for all of the different kinds of contaminants that are out there. That would be a great advance. Again, there are all sorts of innovations that I can't think of, but that some innovator ought to and could think of. And if we can commercialize them and make them cheap enough to use, that would be great. Mm-hmm. I would note, technology alone is not the solution to our water problems. In many places, the issue is institutions and bad water laws or bad economics. So technology is a piece of the puzzle, but I would argue just one piece of it.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of the politics, how do you think about shifting water burden, right, to places that are less regulated in the world? So, it's obviously we're not going to ship water in, but the uses of water can be moved to where water exists. And there are places that have less onerous regulations, which might make it cheaper to, whatever it is that's being done with water be done in places outside of the US or other parts of the other richer areas of the world. Do you think of that as the sort of thing? Is it the same as, for example, moving manufacturing to a place that has cheaper labor, where it lifts the people in those places economically and serves the richer nations that don't have access to that cheaper labor?
Yeah, that's already happening. That's absolutely a characteristic of some of our water issues today, and it's a bad thing, in my opinion. Again, it's an example where markets tell us to do something that are not necessarily in the best interests of the environment or poor populations or global environmental health. We've shifted already a bunch of heavy manufacturing overseas. In the water world, we have something called virtual water. That is the idea that we can measure the amount of water required to do the goods and services, to produce the goods and services that we want. For example, it takes 1,000 tons of water as a rule of thumb to produce a ton of grain. It takes a lot more water than that, maybe 15,000 tons of water to produce a ton of beef. It takes a certain amount of water to produce semiconductors, a certain amount of water to produce a ton of steel. And a lot of the production of the goods and services that we want in the richer countries of the world can be done more cheaply in some of the developing countries. But there's a water consequence of that. We could reduce our own water footprint here, but we increase the water use to produce those goods and services somewhere else. That's a problem. It's sometimes done for economic reasons, but the consequences can be more pressure on water resources in that country where we're shifting goods and services. China has all sorts of serious water problems because of their industrial makeup now, because of the pollution that those industries are causing, because their water quality laws aren't as strict as in Europe or in the United States. And so we want to produce the goods and services that we want, but shifting the externalities, the consequences of that production to developing countries or countries where regulations aren't as strong produces bad things.
I'm just curious, is there any international regulation of water usage or attempts at it? Obviously international regulation is a complex and fraught issue, but are there attempts at managing the international use of water?
There are some. That's a difficult political question, but it's a really important one. I mean, it has to do ultimately with how we structure the international community overall. We have water laws in the United States. We have water laws in individual states. And there are discussions about the extent to which states have rights to do things versus the federal government. In Europe, the European Union has been pretty good about setting standards for the international union, the European Union, for the multiple nations that are part of that union. And so there are water quality laws that apply to multiple states that belong now to the international union. And they can't have separate individual water quality laws. They have to meet a standard that applies across those countries' borders. There are international agreements about cooperation over shared water resources where water crosses a border, but those are few and far between. We have to get better at that. I'm a fan of expanding the ability of international agreements to manage water quality laws, water sharing laws, the human right to water at the international level rather than the national level. But that gets to a whole debate about national sovereignty, about individual countries' abilities to pass laws and manage laws within their own borders. That's a big question.
Mm-hmm. It certainly is. And this is kind of my last big question. When you think about climate change, just to give a sense of what the effect of climate change on water will be, do we expect less fresh water? I just don't have a sense of what the anticipated effects right now of climate change are on water, and what local or international issues do you see rising in importance as a function of climate change?
Yeah, that's another great question. Let me go back a step because it's tied to the question you just asked. We do have international environmental agreements that bind nations who agree to those agreements to do certain things. And maybe the most successful example was the Montreal Protocol a number of years ago, when we learned that the emissions of certain kinds of chemicals were destroying the ozone layer that protects all of us from ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And we passed an international agreement, the Montreal Protocol, that almost all countries, especially the industrialized countries, agreed to limit the production of ozone-destroying chemicals. That was a hugely successful international agreement, and it's been signed by almost all the countries of the world, and has been abided by all the major industrial countries that produce those terrible chemicals. And we're solving the ozone problem. We're reducing the destruction of the ozone layer. It's a great example. And climate change is another one where we need an international agreement to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, because every country in the world burns fossil fuels and contributes to the problem. And of course, the richer, larger economies are most responsible for that problem. But we don't have an effective climate agreement yet, and we really need one. And in part, we need one because some of the worst impacts of climate change are going to be, and I would argue are already evident, on water resources. Higher temperatures means more demand for water, more evaporation, more crop use of water, increased water in the atmosphere, which we're already seeing, and more energy in the atmosphere associated with higher temperatures means more extreme events. Mm-hmm. And again, we're already seeing more extreme floods and more extreme droughts, those extreme hydrologic events that really kill us. That's where the damages to society and to economies and industries and agriculture occurs. And so climate change is a water problem. Ultimately, we have a saying in the climate community, and I'm a climate scientist in part by training, that if climate change is a shark, water resources are the teeth that's going to bite us. And we're already seeing that.
So you predict that water really will be the way. I mean, we can think about rising seas and the effect of erosion and the kind of damage we've seen from actually just here in California, the rains that we've seen, and also the droughts. That's how you see climate change really affecting us in the future.
It's not the only thing. Sea level rise is going to be disastrous for hundreds of millions of people along the coast. To some degree, that's also a water problem. It's affected by rising temperatures that melts land ice in Greenland and Antarctica and the glaciers. That's a water problem in the countries that depend on glacier melt, but it's a sea level rise problem as well. Obviously, higher temperatures and impacts on agriculture is going to be tremendously important, but ultimately, all of these things are tied to the hydrologic cycle, which is part of the climate cycle.
Mm-hmm. And if you were to say this is to our audience, what they should be thinking about in terms of being a part of a solution on this, right? What would you have them focus on? And this includes people who might be going into business and thinking about, what needs to be done for society? How can I contribute to society? What would you tell them?
Well, I would say there's a role for everyone, no matter where you are, in addressing these kinds of problems. There are roles for us as individuals to ensure that our own personal use of water is as efficient as possible, that we're aware of where our water comes from and how to protect the ecosystems that provide that water, that we're aware of the implications of our water use on water quality, that we're buying water efficient devices in our homes, that we're voting for politicians who understand the importance of water or become those politicians as individuals on our local water boards. There are lots of roles for individuals to address these issues, but there's a role for communities. There's a role for private corporations who have a big impact on the hydrologic cycle and their own water use and watersheds where they operate. Obviously, as we've talked about to some degree, there's a role for governments. So I talk about this in The 3 Ages of Water, the book that I wrote about the human history of water, the implications of the water crisis for our communities today, and the potential to move to a more positive future for water, and the role, again, as individuals or communities or corporations or governments, institutions to address those problems and to push for the solutions that are available.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Well, thank you. Water's such a big topic. We could talk forever, I know, about it. But the more we know about the challenges that face us, but also about the solutions that are available, the more likely we are to tackle the problems that face us.
Well, I appreciate the work you're doing on it, and thanks again for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you, Brian.